Ukraine says at least 16 people have been killed in an explosion in a town in the eastern Donetsk region. President Zelensky's office posted this video of the moment the blast happened in Kostyantynivka. The date on the video suggests the video was shot today. The town is near the front line of the fighting, around 20 miles from the disputed city of Bakhmut. The sound and the way people in the street look up suggests it may have been a missile. Ukrainian officials say at least 28 other people were wounded. The attack happened shortly after the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Kyiv, the first visit by a senior American official since Ukraine launched its counteroffensive against Russian forces. Well, let's go live now to Kyiv and to our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams. Paul, tell us more.
Yeah, this happened about 3 hours ago, and as President Zelensky has indicated, he was very quick to point the finger of blame at Russia. He actually said it was Russian artillery that was responsible for this. This town is within Russian artillery range. We don't yet know exactly what the nature of the projectile was, but certainly the images that have circulated subsequently of the damage done are pretty horrendous. Blood inside shops, bodies lying in the street, mangled cars for some distance. This was a very considerable explosion, and we think probably one of the worst single incidents of its kind since around April. Ukraine has become terribly familiar with devastating attacks, but it has been a while since something on this scale occurred. We think the death toll at the moment is around 16, with at least 30 people injured. Rescue workers obviously still on the scene looking for survivors, but certainly the government here in Kyiv in absolutely no doubt as to who was responsible.
And Paul, we'll get more details on that as the story develops. But as I mentioned earlier, this attack came shortly after Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, arrived in Kyiv, and a big announcement is expected. What more do we know about that?
Yeah, so this is Mr. Blinken's fourth visit to Kyiv since the full-scale Russian invasion, his sixth as Secretary of State, and every time he comes here, he comes bearing gifts of some kind or another. There have been dozens now of American pledges over the last 18 months of assistance. We believe this one, some of the details we're likely to hear today, perhaps others later in the week, we think will total something in the region of $1 billion. That's pretty much par for the course, it has to be said, in terms of American pledges. It'll be a mixture of military assistance, probably the bulk of it, but also civilian assistance, because the Americans are very keen to try and prop up Ukraine's economy, which has been absolutely devastated by the conflict over the last 18 months. But for Mr. Blinken, he received a very warm welcome here. He's a very familiar face. And even before he arrived, there was the sound of war here in the capital. With America's Secretary of State just hours away, a fresh wave of attacks at dawn. Kyiv's well-drilled air defences called into action once more. Outside the city, a supermarket damaged by falling debris, wrecked early in the war, in the process of being repaired, now wrecked again.
My home is your home.
And a familiar welcome too, Mr. Blinken bringing a fresh pledge, more than $1 billion in security and other assistance.
Every time I'm here, I'm struck by the extraordinary bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian forces, Ukraine's leadership. And I'm here first and foremost to demonstrate our ongoing and determined support for Ukraine as it deals with this aggression.
This is Mr. Blinken's first visit since Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in June. After weeks of slow progress, Ukraine says the pace is picking up. The cost in men and equipment is high. President Zelensky says more supplies are on the way and that Ukraine will step up its own production.
There will be new supplies. It is very important that there will be new production of our weapons, and we have outlined several priority items with the warriors. This is what needs to be done. We will do it.
At Kyiv's wall of remembrance, yet another gesture of solidarity. Denmark's Prime Minister paying her respects. Her country among 3 planning to send F-16 jets by the beginning of next year. And so Mr. Blinken is actually going to be spending the night here in Kyiv. I think that's a first, and he will be holding a press conference with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba a little bit later on. Probably get to hear some more details about the precise nature of this latest package of assistance. Back to you.
Paul, thank you. That's our correspondent Paul Adams there in Kyiv. Well, let's stay with that subject and go live now to Bangkok to speak to Michael Bosque, who's Global Affairs Analyst at the Atlantic Council. So thank you very much for joining us. And we heard a little bit about what the meeting is going to entail there from our correspondent. What do you think is the priority for both sides?
Sure. Well, I think a couple of things. Mr. Blinken, of course, wanting to give the Ukrainians a big pat on the back for their successes so far. But also, I think the meeting is very carefully timed ahead of the G20, but also the UN General Assembly at the end of September. And by the way, while this story was breaking just a few minutes ago, Ukrainian Telegram channels started to report that Mr. Zelensky will be going to New York at the end of September for those UN meetings, including a meeting of foreign ministers. And I think when you put all of this together, Mr. Blinken's visit, what Mr. Zelensky is doing, it's time to counter weakening support in Western capitals, especially for the war in Ukraine. Everyone on everyone's minds, especially the Ukrainians, next year's presidential elections in the U.S., when the White House will very likely flip to the Republican side.
And how much support domestically is there for continued support?
Well, this is a big problem. You know, a lot of Americans with these natural disasters happening, economic crisis, cost of living crisis, all of that, they're questioning why billions are going to the war in Ukraine. But the answer to that, of course, is that if the Russians are not pushed back, then this war will come even further to their doorsteps, in my opinion, through higher costs for things like wheat, bread, higher fuel prices. And by the way, another important aspect of this support, I should say, is that the Americans look on the brink of announcing new weaponry for Ukraine, depleted uranium rounds. These are really, really effective in terms of piercing the heavy Russian tank armor. A bit controversial because they could leave some biohazards in the environment, but it just goes to show that the Americans are following the lead of, for example, the United Kingdom, and pretty much giving everything the Ukrainians are asking for to bring this war to a finish line.
And Michael, we heard just in the past hour, we heard the news emerging of that horrific explosion in Ukraine. Do you think that that is connected to Mr. Blinken's visit, and do you think it will affect it? And of course, at this stage, it's all very early in the development of this news story. But just it would be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is straight out of the Russian playbook. I mean, they've put drones and missiles into Kyiv when other leaders were there, for example, the UN Secretary General. But, you know, as I've said many, many times, including on air on BBC, as soon as we thought we've seen the bottom, the absolute bottom of Russian inhumanity, they go ahead and surprise us and do something even more grave, even more heinous. And in this one, Kostyantynivka, Paul reported the numbers, 16 dead, 30 or so injured. But Kostyantynivka in eastern Ukraine has suffered disproportionately. Previous to this particular strike, about 10 people at least died in other strikes. They've had about 3 major ones there so far. And again, this is on a civilian target, a marketplace during the daytime. Absolutely terrible.
That's right. At least 16 people killed there, which is the latest that we've had from that. Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's really good to get your analysis on that. Michael Bosque from the Atlantic Council. Thank you.